Hello and welcome to the virtual edition of our year-round screening series, Film Independent Presents, and this Q&A for the new Amazon release, Sound of Metal. I'm Jen Wilson, Senior Programmer with Film Independent. Before we started, I have to give some praise to our supporters. So thank you to our incredible lead sponsor, the Hollywood Foreign Press Association, our screening partner, Vision Media, and also our media partner, the Los Angeles Times. For those of you watching live today, please do take advantage of the question box at the bottom of the screen. You can submit a question for me to ask Darius towards the end of our Q&A today. And now I'd like to welcome our very special guest today, the writer and director of Sound of Metal, Darius Marder.
Hey.
Welcome. How are you?
Jen, it's just
So
great
great to see you.
to see you. Yeah.
So I should explain, you and I met each other many years ago at the 2008 Los Angeles Film Festival, which was my very first year with the festival,
Oh yeah. Cool.
where you premiered the documentary Loot, which you also ended up winning a prize for. And
Yep.
also a very special moment between you and somebody happened that was captured on film, and I'm going to share it here.
Oh man, it's so crazy. Well, you had to think,
There it is.
boom. And that that is really like
That's you and Guillermo.
a life-changing moment. But let me give you a little background, little inside baseball on this. So, imagine this. I spend years and years and years and years making this crazy movie, Loot. I think I shot 500 hours for this movie. And, I get to this festival, I'm broke. I was literally homeless there. I couldn't get a hotel room. And it was that story. And someone said, "Are you coming to the Hellboy premiere?" And and I was kind of like, yeah, maybe. I mean, they were like, "Oh, well, you should come to the Hellboy premiere." And I was like, okay. So I go to the Hellboy premiere with my friend, my dear friend Misha Collins. And I remember I just like threw on a sweatshirt, that gray one. And I go and before Hellboy, Guillermo gets up and he starts describing this film, and then I find that he's saying, he says the word loot, and my brain can't really process this because there wasn't supposed to be an announcement at the Hellboy premiere. That wasn't advertised. So I find myself, now I had leveraged everything in the world to be there, and I had kids at home, and I felt like like at that point I just couldn't believe how crazy I was that I had done this and ended up at this moment. And he's announcing that I won, which came with a $50,000 prize, which completely saved my ass. And I find myself on stage, and he looks at me and he goes, "You fucking deserve it, man." He's like, "You deserve it." And I look in his eyes and I'm like, "You saw the film?" And he went, "No." It was so great. And then this was us outside, and man, what a beautiful dude he is. And it was just like one of the true, like, transcendent moments in my life.
Did he just wrap his arms around you and pick you up?
Yeah, he actually said something. Can I say it?
Yeah.
It's kind of hilarious. He said, he said, "Don't you have a fucking heart on? Don't you?"
Oh my God.
And I was like, "Well, I mean, maybe." It was just amazing, and he's just such an awesome dude. But yeah,
I have heard that he likes to give hugs, and he will give anybody a hug that wants to have a hug.
I'm a huggy guy. I'm not afraid of a hug, and nowadays we should be. But I'm that was perfect for me, as you can
Well, this
tell.
is a masterpiece of a picture, and I will always cherish it.
Oh, it's so great. I love
Um,
that. I love that exists. Well, it's great to see you, Jen.
it's so good to see you too. I feel so grateful to have to come back together with you after so many years.
Okay,
And
so here's the thing though. I know I'm interrupting you. So I was working on Sound of Metal when Guillermo was hugging me.
okay,
That's that, just to set the stage a little.
yes.
Like
So
that's how long this has been happening.
let's let's back up a second. I usually start these Q&As with everybody's origin story for how you became a filmmaker, because we have so many aspiring filmmaker members
Hmm.
for Film Independent. So what is your origin story? Because you didn't start out, weren't you a chef? Didn't you used to be a chef?
Well, yeah, I mean, I have I've worn some hats. I will preface everything by saying I started making films in my late teens. I hustled to get an XL1 camera in my early 20s. I started shooting docs. I then was shooting, I had a child early, and I was like hustling, and I was shooting wedding videos, and that's how I learned to edit. So let's just say I had been doing it, and I always knew I was going to do it. I cut a Super 8 movie together and spliced it and projected it on a barn wall. And
Okay.
was probably wearing something very similar to what you're wearing now, Jen, when I did that.
Good.
And
Yes.
and I projected this thing with some music playing next to it, and I just was like, oh my god. It was, I mean, I always loved film, but I had that moment of just like, I have to do this forever. And then, I came from nowhere land in terms of connections. I never really believed much in school in general. So I come from a really maybe hyper intellectual family, certainly on my father's side, of artists um, and geniuses and scientists and stuff. And I needed to not be in school. I wasn't really school material, but I was also a very kind of not reckless. Like, I was always looking for the edge in life, and when I was young, before I had a child, I was pushing boundaries, not in terms of drug use, but in terms of just wanting to find it. And sometimes it was pretty dark. Sometimes it was like I found myself in the middle of deserts, kind of like, hungry and cold kind of a guy. It was really the like exploration of the human soul. And there were some tough times back then. And when I was at a very, very low point, my middle school teacher called me, who was the only teacher I ever connected with. She's an absolute genius teacher, and she had recognized something in me in the way of writing, and she asked me if I wanted to come teach with her. And I came, and it was like a light. It was like an angel called me out of nowhere when I most needed it. And so at a very young age, at the age of 18, I went and taught seventh and eighth grade. And um, and I did it for 4 years. And the reason I bring it up is because when I was teaching these kids, first of all, I bring it up because it shows up in Sound of Metal. Secondly, I bring it up because when I was teaching these children who were so amazing, when I was teaching them writing and putting on plays and running choruses and doing all these things with these kids, it was working with them that really opened up myself, allowed myself to write. And I think it was essential in my own journey. So that was kind of my school, was teaching children. And then when I was done with that, I kind of hit this like, how does one like myself go from this place to making movies? And now I have one kid and eventually another on the way. So if I jump forward, I had, again, hustling. I'm just hustling. And now I live in New York. And, you know, like, I'm always interested in this. I see these young people making movies and I'm like, how the hell are you doing that? Because I was like, I knew I want to make these things, but how the hell do you do it? And I say it, I know I'm speaking to people that are hustling like I've always been hustling. And I feel like people never talk about this, they never talk
Yeah.
about the hustle and how you go from a dream to a reality, which I've always found to be so perplexing. And and for me, it has taken stark declarations of intention. That's the only way that I have done anything. I have never been given anything. So it's always been these like unbelievably like when I say stark, I mean really betting the universe, like going, okay, I'm going to put as much at stake as humanly possible and see what can happen. And that's what I've done over and over again in my career. And that has showed itself in the form, I like to think of it as the power of no, because I have said no repeatedly in my life when it comes to when you really ask yourself, what do I most want? What do I most want in the world? Not necessarily what do I most need, but what do I most want? Sometimes you have to say no to those things that are giving you what you need. And those are scary
Sure.
moments always. And my life has been marked with the chapters of no. So that I was hustling, you know, I had uninsured children in Brooklyn trying to like do this thing. I was shooting wedding videos and you know, wanting to and I was writing, but really always pushing past those demons and trying to get shit on the page. And I was a food stylist. I was working for Martha Stewart, and I hit this moment in my career as a personal chef and a food stylist where I kind of like realized, shit, I could start making money doing this. Like that's bad, you know. I mean, real money. You know, I was starting to kind of I could make a couple $100,000 a year doing this work. You
As a
know,
food stylist?
oh yeah, you could make money doing that work.
What
And
what is a food stylist? Is that someone that styles food for photos and videos and
correct.
commercials? Okay.
Yeah. It's phenomenal work. And actually, people who work in that industry are super. I met so many nice people. It's a little different than fashion. I also worked in the fashion world too, just hustling. Fashion world is just, oh, it's enough to make you want to, but food styling is a little different, a little more down to earth. It was kind of wonderful work, but it was essentially boring for me. You know, it wasn't a career I wanted. It was just something I could do, and it was very enjoyable. You know, you go to work, you go to a studio, you know, and you're kind of like, you know, cooking and doing your thing, and it's great, and you could make money. And then I got scared. I thought, oh shit, I'm gonna get comfortable doing this. I gotta say no.
Right, it's the golden handcuffs, right?
Goldenish handcuffs. And so I actually did that. I declared to the universe, I'm never doing this again. I called everybody I knew and I said, I'll never work in this industry again. Goodbye forever. And it were funny conversations like, really? And I'm like, yep, bye. So a week later, I found myself literally a week later, and forgive me if you've heard this story, but I found myself in a sandbox in Prospect Park, and this guy from Utah who had just moved to New York came and sat down next to me, and we're watching our boys play. And I had been writing a script on freehand on a pad of paper because I had kind of declared to myself, I'm a filmmaker. Come hell or high water, that's what I'm doing. And he sat down, we started talking. He was a fascinating guy, Dan Campbell, really smart and interesting. And eventually he was like, what do you do? And I said, I'm a filmmaker, you know, with an absolute assurity because I had decided I was. And he said, wow. And then he started describing this guy in Utah to me that turned into the film Loot. And I said to him,
The treasure hunter.
the treasure hunt. And I said to him that day in the sandbox, I said, I'm going to make that movie. And he said, really? And I said, uh-huh. He was like, yeah, what have you made that I can see? And I said, nothing. And he was like, okay. And then he said, I guess I'll produce it. And he was like, what does that mean? I said, that means you're going to pay for it. He was like, all right. And we had martinis. We flew like 2 days later to Utah, and I shot that for 5 years. So that was the first no that turned into something really life-changing for me. And then I kept, tell me if I need to shut up. I kept doing that. And basically, long story short, I found my way into editing at that point, which I could do pretty well-ish. I'm a very good editor, but very like not a technical person. So I was never, I'm a mess, you know? So good editors are much better than me, but I fell into editing. Again, I could make good money editing. And I had to cut that off and say, no, I can't do this. I'm not an editor, and I cannot work for other people. I cannot make other people's movies. I am not cut out for it. So I had to say, I can only make money writing or directing. And that was my rule for myself. And that is when I started showing up in an office every day and writing when there was no goddamn money for it and no hope of ever getting anywhere ever. And it was just those are lonely days. But that led to Place Beyond the Pines, and that led to this movie, which came from that degree of intentionality.
So, Sound of Metal, I think I've read is something that Derek C. in France was working on,
Yeah.
and he asked you to collaborate. Do you want to talk about how this sort of, because he's a co-writer, but you ended up directing. How did it end up becoming your project?
He's not a co-writer, he's a story by.
Story by. Okay.
And there's a difference there's a big difference in this case because he literally didn't write a word of it. But on the other hand, he did, because what he had been, within 2 minutes of meeting Derek 13 years ago, and he is such a dear friend and such a fabulous filmmaker, within 2 minutes of meeting him, we were talking about this. And because I was shooting Lewd at the time, he was shooting this film called Metalhead. And Metalhead had derived from his own experience as a metal drummer, Derek's experience losing his own hearing. And he had been shooting this band Jucifer, which is a two-person band, a man and a woman, who travel endlessly, and they're a real band. And he wanted to introduce this fictional element to make it a kind of a hybrid. And that's where we really connected, because I was very interested in this narrative doc overlap, which Loot kind of is a super narrative doc, although it's not a hybrid. And he was interested in this hybrid. So we kind of creatively connected. And then meanwhile, he was getting Blue Valentine going, and we were talking a lot about that. And essentially Blue Valentine just made it impossible for him to pay any attention to that idea. And then we started writing Place Beyond the Pines. And I remember even saying to Derek at the time, I was like, the hell with anything else. That's the one, because there was something I saw in that and felt so deeply in this concept, which some of it I saw very quickly, and some of it took years to develop. But essentially he gave his baby up for adoption, knowing he would never make it. And I took it over. At one point he said, "Will you finish the film I'm making?" I said, "No, I need to start it over. I need to write this thing. You're not making the film I want to make, even though I loved it." So there is the DNA of that project in Sound of Metal very much. And in that sense, he's a co-writer, but not literally a co-writer. He didn't write any of it. I wrote it with my brother.
Your brother, Abraham, right?
Yeah.
So I have so much admiration for this film for so many reasons, but it takes us into so many communities that have felt, I think, misrepresented or underrepresented in other films, which is the deaf community and the recovery community.
Yep.
In this story, I actually found the aspect, I'm not in the deaf community, but I am in the recovery community. I actually found that the recovery community aspects in this to feel more real than in any other film that I had ever felt, or any other film or TV show. It felt real and not hollow. Do you want to talk about your things that you did to flesh out the aspects that have to do with recovery, and then also, of course, who helped you flesh out the aspects that dealt with the deaf community?
Well, first of all, just the fact that you say it felt real means a lot to me, because that's kind of my highest aspiration. I think much of it was real. And I think it's, so much of this dance of filmmaking for me is about, very similar to making docs. I don't find there's energetically much difference directing a doc than directing a piece of fiction for me, because they feel very much about accessing something sincere and real and daring and kind of cultivating an environment to find that. So in the realm of addiction and recovery, first of all, there was a lot of groundwork. I have my own personal experiences with it, and but there was also a lot of groundwork done just on the character building level for Riz. He spent a lot of time in groups in various forms, not just alcoholism or addiction, but also codependence and, you know, interesting other aspects of that kind of under that umbrella. But then a lot of what happened in the deaf community. So there is this overlap of these two questions you asked. Now, number one, you know, shooting within deaf culture was very much about um, was very much about deaf culture representing itself, and I wanted to treat that as I would a documentary. This is not a film. It's so important to say this because it's so easily missed. And even sometimes with the best of intentions, it's not a film about deaf culture. It would be very hubristic for me to make that. It's not my world to represent, but it's a film that kind of invites deaf culture to represent itself. Um, insofar as I obviously cast entirely from that world, and it's part of why it took so long to cast the movie, because as much as Hollywood loves to talk a good game about being inclusive, they're not inclusive when you're trying to make the damn movie, and I can tell you that as a fact. Um, so I worked for many years to support that vision, and what that was looking, you know, casting locally and finding people that were really dealing, not just deaf people, because the deaf culture is not a monolith. So it's everything and many things. So finding people that had been struggling and working with these issues very, very specifically, and literally creating a community, Joe's community, Joe's house. And the most essential aspect of that was finding Joe. And that was really, really tough. And coming across a person like Paul Racy, who plays Joe, was just such an extraordinary experience, because he is he's a two-time Vietnam veteran. When I say two-time, two tours. He's dealt very seriously with addiction and alcoholism, and he's taught deaf AA groups, and he's a CODA. His first language is ASL. I don't think he spoke English until age 6 or so. Um, so he's from deaf culture, and he's Joe. And there's a lot of, and that was essential in creating the feeling that I think you were speaking to, Jen,
Yeah.
because he you know, he understood what it meant to hold the responsibility of the group that he was going to be holding. And that group was a group of real people. We did real groups. You know, the AA group that you see in the movie, we shot the whole thing. You know, everyone had their own story. And I wish I had time to make the 9-hour movie, but everyone has their own story and their own real, what they brought. And Joe, as played by Paul, held that. And he held it in a way with so much at stake and so much responsibility for that I think it hopefully pervades the screen.
He's phenomenal. It's absolutely one of my favorite performances this year.
So special. He's
Is
such a gift.
Paul Racy, yeah.
Well, can I speak to one thing about Paul? I was driving to the land. I had spent years finding the location for this. It was very hard to find the actual house for a lot of reasons, but I won't go into it. But I drove Paul to this house. And you imagine this guy had been working in Hollywood for 40 years and no one had ever noticed him. And here he has this role of a lifetime. And, you know, it was just like an extraordinary experience. So I drove him to this house. I have a video of this actually. And he looks at this place, he just starts crying, and I almost can't say it because I'm such a softie, but he just he looked at this house, and he just knew the weight of it. And part of the knowing the weight, I've come to realize after working with the deaf community, you know, invisible disabilities are so intense because the hearing world people, the able-bodied people, they don't understand by looking at someone what people are dealing with. And for people who aren't that, or people like Paul who have grown up taking care of deaf people since day one, being a liaison between two worlds, two cultures, utterly unrecognized. I mean, we don't know who codas are. Codas are children of deaf adults. We don't understand that. We look at Paul and say, that's a hearing guy, the end. Well, no, not true at all. He's from deaf culture. People who grow up with that invisible reality that is utterly ignored by others have a hyper empathy, because they have an awareness that we don't, that was brought to my attention many, many times in the making of this film, as an able-bodied person, just brought to my attention. It's like, as empathetic as I think I am, and I am, and sensitive as I think I am, and I hope I am, it was just a learning curve constantly, because, you know, for these all, I saw it through and through throughout the deaf community. These were people that noticed things, noticed each other, and moved to help before anybody else would ever even know anything was happening.
That really, really important scene um, towards towards the end of the film between Paul and Reuben, when Paul tells Reuben that he has to leave the community, brought up a memory that I had about the controversy over cochlear implants in the deaf community. And I was wondering if that was something that you were aware of when you were writing the film, um, because I was watching the movie with somebody else, and they asked me, "Is he mad? Is he throwing him out because he got the cochlear implants?" And I was like, "Well, I don't know if that could be a part of it. Do you want to talk about
Yeah, sure.
the cochlear implants in the deaf community, and this and the whether you think he's being thrown out because of the implants?"
Yeah, I mean, first of all, yeah, I'm very aware of that conversation, and as aware of it as I am, I'm loath to have an opinion about it. I don't really, because I don't really think it's mine to have an opinion about. It's this is an issue to be discussed and grappled with within deaf culture for sure, and it's and so I'm very aware of it, and I've done a lot of talking and thinking about it, but it's always interesting how people see that scene, because, you know, I, first of all, just to say it, I don't have an opinion about cochlear implants. It's not the point. It's not the point at all. And it's interesting that some people fixate on it when they see the film and others don't. But like for me, you know, cochlear implants are not good or they're not bad. This is a decision people have to make individually. They represent a fascinating dynamic, because deaf culture, if you remove, if everyone were to get implants from day one, it would be the end of deaf culture. And so it's just a fascinating dynamic. And once again, it is not something that I necessarily have an opinion about. What is reflected in the movie is the opinion of many. And there are deaf communities with a capital D that don't believe in that technology for that exact reason. And it makes a lot of sense. I think we can all understand how, we can all see that eventuality. Um, the movie and that moment that you're speaking to, um, there's two things going on. And um, number one, yes, Reuben gets an operation. Um, and but what does Reuben do to get that operation? You know, it was a fascinating balance in the writing and the creation of this story, because Reuben at once has a foot in the community and another foot out of the community. And it was a meditation on, you know, this concept and sickness of fixing things, this idea that we're constantly looking for a fix. There's a reason that, you know, there's a reason it's called Sound of Metal. There's a reason that music's so loud in the beginning. Reuben is constantly trying to get back to that sound. And this idea of getting back to something can be extremely dangerous. And can we really ever get back? Can we really ever go back? And what does that mean when we are fixated on that? And I think it's something we're all grappling with right now. Everyone's like, I can't wait to get back to normal, you know, back. You know, we may not. We may not. There may not be a return to a life we used to have before COVID, you know? And what is it to actually accept that And what kind of a hell do we live in when we cannot?
Right.
So what in that scene, there are a couple things going on. What did he do to get that operation? Well, you saw him sneaking in and out. He was undermining trust, and undermining trust in a group that for which trust is essential, that an undermining of trust is actually going to kill people. Do we believe that had Reuben gotten that operation and decided to get that operation, that Joe would have just said goodbye? We have no use for you anymore. Does that seem like who Joe is? Is that really the hard line he's running, or does this have more to do with Reuben's actual addictive tendencies in that moment?
Right.
And so I'm fascinated with the dynamic that can and might occur in this movie, where as hearing people, we fixate. I wanted that. I was essentially creating that, an experience that hearing people or able-bodied people can watch this movie and find themselves fixating in the same way that Reuben is.
Yeah, this is in particular one of the scenes that I think will resonate really deeply with the recovery community, because I saw it, but I was not watching it with someone who is sober. And when I watched it, or they're not part of the 12 steps community, I was like, oh, he's throwing him out because he's lost his sobriety. But I can see how that, and that losing your sobriety doesn't necessarily mean you've used, right? It doesn't necessarily mean you've used alcohol or drugs. It's that you're engaging in addictive behavior again.
And remember, does he ever use? Right? I mean,
No.
so essentially he came in as a person in need, having never used,
Right.
and we know this about addicts. Like, we know that's a reality, that's a truth. I mean, look at Philip Seymour Hoffman, that these moments come where we get into an addictive spiral, and if we don't get that help, and we aren't able to get that help, it can be deadly. So yeah.
I want to talk about how the story structure of this sort of subverts your expectation right away, because normally what would happen is he would start to become deaf, he would start using, she would start using, they would spiral down the rabbit hole of drugs again, and then in the end find sobriety again. But instead what happens is she calls their sponsor,
Exactly.
or who I assume's their sponsor.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Um
Hector.
and I was like, you know what? I feel like so many writers don't choose this direction because they don't think that starting with sobriety and staying with sobriety is going to hold the tension. But obviously in this movie there's still so much tension. There's still, despite the fact that he doesn't, do the familiar thing of going down the rabbit hole of drugs, you still maintain an incredible tension in the film. Do you want
Wait,
to
it's
did
a
you
great
did you
question,
see
Jen.
yourself as sort of subverting that story structure when you were writing it?
Yeah, entirely. And I was much more excited to do that than the other. And as a matter of fact, I wasn't excited to do the other at all. Um, I think it's so much more interesting to try to hold that tension without using. I think it's so much more interesting to, like a horror movie where we're scared of the monster we don't see, um, that to hold that monster and never ever see it so overtly as the using, but to see it in other forms, like we were talking about in that other scene. That was a much more difficult film to write. It was a much more difficult film to create and make, but so much more interesting to me. And um, it's remarkable that people sometimes, over and over again, people talk about this, the addict story as being predictable, but there isn't any. This is not that. And I, at least not for me, and the journey of creating it was far from predictable, but what it really meant was holding a truth in every moment that was really, really specific in order to hold that, to maintain that tension even while you weren't using. It was an extremely difficult thing to do, both in the writing and then again in the editing. But what it meant is, in the shooting, is having that intentionality in every moment. And I kind of saw it as like caring so much for the characters you see on the screen, or feeling their real human selves that you so desperately didn't want to see that undermined. You know, you
Yeah.
didn't, you did, you know, so you hold that tension throughout. And then you know, shockingly, the thing that you think that you're fixated on, the fix, you know, the play on even the word fix, becomes this, again, a representation of that monster that was in the very first frame of the movie, you know.
Um, the ending of this is really special, and I loved the choices that you made for the ending. You know, where Reuben's character sort of ends up. Was this something that was sort of difficult to formulate? Um,
Yes.
because
It really was.
I was watching it with someone who watches a lot of TV, and
Yeah.
they were sort of at the end. They were like, "Well, what happens? Is he going to be okay?" And I'm like, "Well," I said, "You're used to watching a format of television filmmaking where all the outcomes are given to you all the time, and that's what you come to expect. And in this film, you're not necessarily given an outcome. Um, but
You-
I think you're given some clues. So how do you as a
yeah.
filmmaker decide how many clues to give as to where Ruben's going next?
Well, I'm very interested in pushing the boundaries of that. I mean, my favorite experiences in film, watching films, are when I think we have this incredible capacity as humans to create contexts and create entire worlds that are not on the screen. And though and that wonderful thing only happens when the viewers are trusted, and when they are not held, when their hands aren't held. And if you can get to that, it's a very high bar for me anyway. I really like to push for that. So and I think it's all over this movie, where, like you had said, the sponsor, and you know, it's never, you're never told it's a sponsor. You know, your brain has to kind of sort through this. Who are they calling? What he was smoking? What did that mean? Because that's the first moment there even addiction shows its face. You know,
Right.
so again, it's that kind of language that I spend a lot of time on, and think about ways that we can create muscles in the viewers. Because I like this. I like when I feel my brain engaged in a movie, where I go, oh, I got to watch a little closer, and I have to listen a little harder, because I'm not gonna, Morgan Freeman isn't telling me what the Penguins are doing, you know.
Right.
So the 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 end of the movie is very much that, but on the other hand, there is some very, very specific language, at least from me, in my intentionality about the end of this film. And some of that has to do with, you know, I don't know how much you want to get into that, but the first of all, the ending was something that was this true north that I always felt I had to earn. And earning that ending, which is a very visceral ending, actually, it's an ending you feel, I hope, rather than just think about, because it's something that is an actual physical reality. You know, it's that cutting off, that literal silence. So earning that was very important to me, and part of that meant going through a grueling visceral process. You had to go through that. So you know, it cannot, if you slather this movie with score, you don't earn that ending. You again, score in films is always do it. That's a Morgan Freeman with the Penguins. Score is telling you what to feel and holding your hand almost invariably. And so this is a much more visceral process, and you're working toward earning that ending, which hopefully involves a kind of a fundamental feeling of truth, which isn't about what he does next, but it is about the essence of what happens in that moment. And you know, it's a direct reflection of the first scene, of the first shot of the movie, that last shot. And it's, you know, I had a kind of an interesting, diligent cinematic language in this movie, because I really did want it to feel pretty naturalistic and not showy. I don't love when you are kind of like, wow, what a DP, you know, where you're, you know, you've got these crane shots and all this crap. I wanted it to feel natural, but it's also very diligent in its perspective. There isn't a POV for the most part in this movie. It's an HO, it's a POH, it's a point of hearing. And part of that was about actually signaling that we're not doing this. Like when Reuben looks out the window in the beginning in the Airstream, you don't look out with him. You're actually in his point of hearing in that moment. And part of that is kind of getting into that echo chamber, that thing, that noise you hear in the beginning before you see the frame, the sound that precedes the image. That's that internal world. We just don't know it yet. And, you know, and that's how the movie goes. You don't do that until that last scene. That last scene is a point of view, and it gives way to a point of view, and it's suggestive, perhaps,
Yeah.
that we begin to see, and what is it that gives us our ability to see and to take in, and why is it that why is it that this one thing when we were hearing and this noise inside creates almost something that feels ugly, and then in another moment can feel beautiful and transcendent? What is that? You know?
It does, you know, that moment of pure silence at the end of the movie felt like an incredible relief to me after all the sounds preceding it and the imperfect nature of the sound of his implants. I was like, he looks relieved to take the implants off, and I felt relieved at the silence too. And I was like, it just worked so perfectly for the end of the movie.
Yeah, and
Um,
you know, and it's a beautiful way to put it, as just relief. But the relief isn't the absence of sound. The relief is the intentionality behind it. And I think that's what's so important about this, is that, you know, deaf people don't necessarily have a quiet within them. You know, that quiet, when Joe's saying, have you ever sat and had a feeling of stillness? That isn't about quiet. You know, we can have quiet without stillness. So that relief is about stillness more than it
right.
is about quiet.
All right, I'm going to ask some questions from our members. This is from Matt Warren. How much of the sound design was written into the script, and how much did you discover trying different things out in the edit?
Well, there was a lot of sound design written into the script. It was always going to be that. But best laid plans, you know, some things have to shift. The so but much of it was. This isn't really a language you could have possibly done after the fact. It's way too specific for that. So I actually met my sound designer way before we began shooting, over a year, and we started working on this. And then got my sound designer Nicolas Becker and Daniel Bouquet, who shot the film. We all spent a lot of time together starting to sort out, how do we marry sound and picture for this reason? How do you start to think? And maybe it's my years as an editor, but I, you know, really thinking this way. How do you use the cut to start kind of transferring this perspective? It's actually a really complicated language. It was very tricky to figure out that. So you had to be precise in it. And then there were some revelations also. You know, there were plenty of them in the cutting. And I had this phenomenal editor, Mikkel, who is just such a, you know, a special guy, and really talented. And so, yeah, finding that balance of how far can you push the audience, what's too much, when does it become an idea versus a reality, when is it, you know, that was really important and really tricky, but also pushing more than you might be comfortable pushing, you know, that was also important. So and then the sound mix itself was 23 weeks long for this movie. It was 6 times longer than the shoot, you know. It was such a bit of heavy lifting, and that was also about really dialing up that experience and figuring out what that balance is between diegetic sound and omniscient sound. It was just a wonderful, creative, but grueling process.
So, speaking of grueling, my next question is for you, what was the most difficult part of production for this film?
Oh man, most difficult part. You know, it was interesting when you say difficult, because I really enjoy all the aspects of production. Like I really enjoy it. I like location scouting. I like writing. I like production itself. Shooting is just such a joy. for me. I mean, just really joyful experience. Um, and I love doing this. I love post. I love the editing and but all of it's hard. Um, so I just want, I guess I separate this idea of striving and being and 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 being difficult, because I wasn't unhappy doing any of those things, but it was freaking grueling. I mean, there were, if you could flash back, I kind of have to like call myself and laugh a little, because if you could flash back at me, like just in a complete fit while we were doing, like, this is hard, so it would be hilarious if you could actually flash back. And people who know me and like hear me doing this, I'm pretty intense, but I like that. I want that in life. And I had to fight super hard for this sound. Um, okay, I think the early stages of picture editing were the hardest. I think that I was so, it's so hard to watch assemblies after you shoot, because they suck. And it's something that I because I'm an editor, and a pretty good one. Again, I have good editing instincts. I think I need to qualify it, just because like Mikkel's a good editor. I'm not a good editor, but I have very good editing instincts. And because editing is just writing, it's storytelling. So but I looked for an editor for a very long time that was better than me and not going to take my shit. That was like what I was really after. And so I kept telling editors what I wanted. And if they said yes, I wouldn't hire them. I was looking for someone that pushed back. And when I met Mikkel, I said, here's what I want. We're going to do this together. We're going to sit in a room. I'm going to take this and you're going to take that. And we're going to do this. And he was like, no, that's not the way we're going to do it. He was like, I'm going to do this myself. You're not going to be around for a while.
Oh God, okay.
And he said, because if we don't do that, you'll never know what I'm bringing to the table. We won't know what's you and what's me. This is exactly what I would have said to someone who, if I were cutting their project. And man, I was just like, oh, my heart just went, yes, you are the man for this, So I gave it to Mikkel. And then I showed up in Denmark and had to look at this freaking 4-hour rough cut. And that was probably, I didn't sleep one wink that night. It was so hard. It was just genuinely. So maybe to just, really sincerely give you an answer, that was the bottom for me.
Yeah.
It was so important. Mikkel understands rightly that you have to be willing to go through that in order to get to the other side. And he's exactly right. But boy, it is brutal.
Well, so we're out of time, but I want to talk about, I saw you tweeted something about how to watch this film on Amazon, and it's actually with the subtitles on, correct? Do you want to talk about why?
Well, it's okay to watch it without it, but the open captions is something that I fought really hard for this movie. I don't know of another movie that's released in theaters with open captions. I'm really, there have been movies, and I think it's important to say the deaf community has made them. It's just that maybe a lot of people haven't watched them, but so I'm not the first to do it, but mainstream movies don't. And so if you think about this without pointing a finger or even casting, like, a movie like A Quiet Place, it's yay, a real deaf person, but you didn't open caption your movie. What does that really mean? And it's remarkable that we didn't talk about it. Like, nobody talked about this. You made a movie with a deaf person that everybody celebrated the fact that it was a deaf person, but you only subtitled the ASL. So what does that mean? You made a movie for hearing people only. And if a film happened to have closed captioned in some theater and at certain times, then deaf people could go, but otherwise they couldn't. It's not okay. And this is a wake up that we need. So I realized at a certain point, very, very quickly, my grandmother, my incredible gay Jewish cinephile grandmother, went deaf after taking an antibiotic too young. And she descended into alcoholism and took over, but she petitioned for the rest of her life for open captions. So I dedicated the film to her, and she was a big part of it, actually, and for me and my brother. And I realized, Jesus, oh my God, Well, of course, this has to be open caption. That's a hard thing to do as a filmmaker because you don't really necessarily want words. But as I struggled with it and worked with captions and worked with deaf people, I found it just became remarkably creative. And I found it transformed the movie. So I do encourage people when you stream it to turn the captions on. And I'll give you this little Easter egg, which is that the title of the movie is a caption. And so there's a real direct correlation. Sound of Metal. It's not the sound of metal. Sound of metal. Sound of birds. Sound of tires. Sound of Metal is a caption, and the movie should play. Playing captioned is a real interesting experience. So I do encourage you. That was not a short answer. I can't do it, Jen. I just
I
can't.
know you can't. It's okay. I love you for it. I really wish we had the whole rest of this year to talk
Oh
because I love you and I've missed you so much.
man, I feel the same, Jen.
When you tweeted that, I went to Amazon to check it out, and I noticed that they actually have descriptive capability enabled on this too, which I'd never seen before. So that's
Yeah,
so that blind people can watch the movie too. So
it's so phenomenal.
it's
I mean,
amazing.
I think we're ushering into a new time, a new chapter of awareness around this stuff, which I'm psyched about.
Well, thank you so much. This made my whole day for you to come and talk to me about this film. Congrats on the movie. Congrats on life and everything and being you. And good luck for the coming award season.
Thank you. And we are going to hang, Jen.
Yes.
We are
Somehow,
going.
some way, it's gonna
We're
happen.
just gonna. We're gonna in the future.
Okay.
It won't be like the past, but it'll be like the future.
Okay.
So
Thanks,
much love,
Darius.
and thanks so much. It's so great to see you again.